It was a warm summer day on August 20, 2008, at Madrid Barajas Airport. Passengers on Spanair flight 5022 were eager to begin their journey to Gran Canaria, a destination synonymous with sunlit beaches and relaxing vacations. Families with excited children, couples planning romantic getaways, and business travelers boarding the MD-82 aircraft had no idea their lives were about to change forever. The crew prepared for takeoff amid the bustling operations of one of Europe's busiest airports. Captain Antonio Garcia Luna and First Officer Francisco Javier Muley, seasoned aviators, carried out their pre-flight checks. Both men had accumulated thousands of hours in the cockpit, exuding confidence and professionalism. Yet, lurking beneath the surface, was a chain of errors that would soon lead to one of Spain's deadliest aviation disasters. The flight was already delayed. Earlier that day, the aircraft had experienced a technical malfunction during an attempted departure. The left air temperature probe had failed, forcing maintenance crews to intervene. They disabled the malfunctioning component, but failed to notice a more critical issue. The takeoff configuration warning system, TOWS, had stopped working during the repair. This system was crucial for alerting pilots if the plane's flaps or slats were not properly set for takeoff. Without this safety net, the aircraft would be dangerously vulnerable. Unaware of the looming danger, the crew completed their checklists. However, a crucial step was overlooked. The flaps and slats necessary to generate the lift needed for takeoff remained retracted. Neither the pilots nor the ground crew noticed the omission, and with the TOWS disabled, no alarm sounded to alert them of the critical oversight. As the boarding was completed, passengers settled into their seats. Some gazed out the windows, admiring the view of the sun-drenched tarmac, while others fiddled with their seatbelts or leafed through in-flight magazines. Flight attendants performed safety demonstrations, their voices steady and reassuring. Everything appeared routine. The engines roared to life, signaling the aircraft's readiness for takeoff. As the MD-82 taxied to the runway, anticipation filled the cabin. For many, this was just another flight, a few hours separating them from their holiday destinations or loved ones. At 14:24, Flight 5022 was cleared for takeoff. The plane accelerated down the runway, its nose lifting as it reached the critical rotation speed. But something was terribly wrong. Without the extended flaps and slats, the aircraft lacked the necessary lift. The nose rose briefly before the plane began to pitch erratically. Within seconds, the MD-82 lost altitude, veering off the runway and crashing into a nearby field. A fireball erupted, sending thick plumes of black smoke into the sky, visible from miles away. Passengers and crew had mere moments to comprehend the unfolding nightmare. What should have been the start of a joyful journey had turned into a scene of unimaginable horror. In the aftermath of the Spanair 5022 crash, investigators began piecing together the series of events that led to the tragedy. The spotlight quickly turned to the chain of technical malfunctions and human errors that, together, had sealed the fate of 154 lives. What emerged was a chilling realization. This disaster was not just an accident, it was a preventable tragedy. The most glaring oversight was the failure of the TOW takeoff configuration warning system, TOWS. This critical safety mechanism was designed to alert pilots if the aircraft's flaps and slats were not extended for takeoff. On that fateful day, however, the TOWS had been disabled during maintenance earlier in the morning. The ground crew had addressed a faulty air temperature sensor, but failed to notice that their actions had also rendered the TOWS inoperable. No tests were conducted to ensure the system was functioning before the plane was cleared to fly. Compounding this error was a breakdown in communication. The maintenance team failed to document or communicate the potential consequences of their actions to the flight crew. The pilots, unaware that the TOWS was disabled, proceeded with their standard pre-flight checks, but even these checks were flawed. A critical step, ensuring the flaps and slats were correctly configured, was missed. This oversight could have been caught if standard procedures had been followed rigorously. Investigators later determined that the airline's culture of safety had deteriorated, influenced by financial struggles that led to understaffing and overworked personnel. Many safety protocols were treated as mere formalities, and shortcuts had become a dangerous norm. Another critical factor was the absence of redundancy in the system. Without the TOWs, there was no secondary alarm to alert the crew to the improper configuration. This single point of failure underscored a vulnerability in the MD-82's design, a vulnerability that had gone unnoticed or unaddressed for decades. These lapses weren't isolated incidents, but symptoms of systemic issues within Spanair, and by extension, the aviation industry. From inadequate maintenance practices to the pressures of cost-cutting, the crash of Spanair 5022 revealed a cascade of preventable errors. Each oversight, seemingly minor in isolation, became a critical link in a chain of events that culminated in disaster. The crash of Spanair Flight 5222 unfolded in a matter of seconds, leaving no room for escape or intervention. The MD-82, carrying 172 people, hurtled down the runway at Madrid Barajas Airport, reaching the critical speed for takeoff. Yet as the plane attempted to lift off, it became immediately apparent that something was catastrophically wrong. Without the extended flaps and slats necessary for lift, the aircraft's wings could not generate the aerodynamic force required to sustain flight. The plane's nose pitched upward briefly, giving the illusion of a successful takeoff, but the illusion was short-lived. Just moments later, the aircraft began to lose altitude. Witnesses described the plane as wobbling erratically before slamming back onto the runway. The MD-82 skidded off the tarmac, striking the ground at high speed and careening into a nearby field. Upon impact, one of the engines detached, igniting a massive fireball. Thick black smoke billowed into the sky, visible from miles away as flames engulfed the wreckage. The sound of the explosion was deafening, a gut-wrenching cacophony that echoed across the airport. Inside the cabin, chaos reigned. Passengers, many of whom had been seated calmly just moments earlier, were thrown violently as the plane broke apart. Survivors later described the horror of those final moments, the searing heat, the acrid smell of burning fuel, and the gut-wrenching screams of panic and pain. For most, there was no time to react. Death came swiftly. Airport firefighters and emergency responders were dispatched immediately. Their task was daunting: extinguish the roaring flames, search for survivors, and recover the bodies of the victims. The scene they encountered was one of utter devastation. The fuselage had disintegrated, leaving only fragments scattered across the crash site. Among the wreckage, they found the harrowing reality of human loss. Despite the carnage, there were miraculous stories of survival. 26 people, against all odds, were pulled from the wreckage alive. Most suffered severe injuries, including burns, fractures, and internal trauma. Emergency crews worked tirelessly to stabilize them and transport them to nearby hospitals. Yet for the majority of passengers, the impact was unsurvivable. The moment of impact was not just the end of a flight, it was the culmination of a series of preventable mistakes. For the survivors and the families of the victims, the tragedy left an indelible mark, forever altering their lives. Amid the devastation of the Spanair 5022 crash, the stories of the 26 survivors stand as harrowing reminders of human resilience in the face of tragedy. Each survivor's account offers a window into the chaos and heartbreak of that fateful day, as well as the incredible odds they overcame. Many survivors recalled the horrifying moments leading up to the crash. One passenger, seated near the back of the plane, described the eerie silence before impact as the aircraft began to shudder. It felt as if time slowed down, they later recounted. You could feel something was wrong, but there was nothing you could do. When the plane hit the ground, everything turned to chaos. Passengers were thrown from their seats as the aircraft broke apart. Survivors described the cabin filling with smoke and the searing heat from the flames. Some were fortunate to be seated in sections of the plane that remained relatively intact, providing them a chance to escape before the fire consumed the wreckage. Among the survivors was a mother traveling with her 2 children. Despite suffering severe injuries, she managed to pull both of her children to safety, shielding them from the flames. Her courage and quick thinking saved their lives, though she later spoke of the guilt she felt for those she could not help. Another survivor, a young man seated near an emergency exit, managed to push open the hatch and crawl out moments before the fire reached his section. For many, survival was only the beginning of their ordeal. The physical injuries ranged from broken bones to life-threatening burns, requiring months of medical treatment and rehabilitation. Yet, the emotional scars ran even deeper. Survivors spoke of recurring nightmares, guilt over those who did not make it, and the constant question, why me? Families of the victims also endured unimaginable grief. In the days following the crash, they gathered at hospitals and morgues hoping for news. Some clung to the faint hope that their loved ones had survived, only to face heartbreak when they were identified among the deceased. The survivors' stories, though filled with pain, also carried a message of hope and perseverance. Their accounts became a testament to the strength of the human spirit, even in the darkest of circumstances. The investigation into the crash of Spanair Flight 5022 began immediately, with the Spanish Civil Aviation Accident and Incident Investigation Commission, CIAIC, taking the lead. What investigators uncovered was a complex web of technical failures, human error and systemic shortcomings, painting a sobering picture of how the tragedy unfolded. One of the first findings centered on the takeoff configuration warning system, TAWS, which had failed to alert the pilots that the flaps and slats were not deployed. The malfunction was traced back to earlier maintenance work. During routine repairs on an unrelated issue, the maintenance crew inadvertently disabled the TAWS. Alarmingly, this critical oversight went unnoticed, and no protocols were in place to ensure the system was operational before takeoff. The investigation also revealed gaps in the airline's safety culture. Spanair, facing financial struggles, had been cutting costs in ways that compromised safety. Maintenance staff were overworked, and inspections were often rushed to keep planes in service. The report highlighted a disturbing pattern of prioritizing schedules over thorough safety checks, creating an environment where critical errors could slip through unnoticed. Human error played a significant role as well. The pilots, both experienced, failed to verify the correct position of the flaps and slats during their pre-flight checks. Investigators noted that the omission might have stemmed from a reliance on automated systems like the TAWS, which was expected to alert them to any issues. The lack of redundancy in the MD-82's design exacerbated the situation. Without the TAWS, there was no backup system to warn the crew. Additionally, investigators examined the broader regulatory landscape. They found that oversight of Spanair and other airlines had been inconsistent. Procedures intended to ensure safety compliance were not always enforced, allowing dangerous practices to persist unchecked. The final report, released in 2011, concluded that the crash was a result of both technical and human failures, compounded by systemic issues. It offered 33 recommendations aimed at preventing similar tragedies, including stricter maintenance protocols, improved pilot training, and more robust regulatory oversight. While the findings provided answers, they also deepened the grief for the victims' families. Knowing that the crash was avoidable added an extra layer of anguish, turning what could have been an isolated tragedy into a cautionary tale for the entire aviation industry. As the investigation into Spanair Flight 5022 unfolded, one conclusion became abundantly clear. This was a tragedy that didn't have to happen. Each error, oversight, and decision, seemingly minor in isolation, had formed a catastrophic chain of events that ultimately cost 154 lives. The findings underscored the dangerous consequences of complacency, financial pressures, and systemic failures in the aviation industry. At the heart of the tragedy was Spanair's financial instability. The airline had been struggling for years, facing mounting debt and fierce competition in the European market. To cut costs, Spanair reduced its workforce, consolidated operations, and shortened maintenance schedules. While these measures kept planes flying, they also introduced vulnerabilities. Overworked staff, inadequate resources, and a culture of good enough contributed directly to the oversights that doomed Flight 5022. The lack of a functioning takeoff configuration warning system, TAWS, was emblematic of these issues. A seemingly small maintenance error went uncorrected, highlighting gaps in communication and procedural rigor. The absence of redundancy in the MD-82's design further compounded the problem. The fact that a single system failure could go unnoticed and lead to disaster-raised urgent questions about industry standards and aircraft safety protocols. Beyond the technical and operational flaws, the crash also exposed a deeper problem, a complacent regulatory environment. Spanair had been flagged for safety issues in the past, yet enforcement of corrective measures had been inconsistent. The crash prompted a broader examination of regulatory agencies, revealing that cost-cutting pressures were not confined to airlines, but extended to oversight bodies themselves. The ripple effects of this tragedy extended far beyond Spanair. Airlines around the world faced renewed scrutiny of their safety practices, and regulators tightened oversight procedures. The lessons learned from Flight 5222 became a rallying cry for change in the industry. New policies were implemented to prevent similar incidents, including stricter maintenance checks, enhanced pilot training, and more rigorous compliance audits. For the families of the victims and the survivors, however, these changes came too late. Their loss was immeasurable, and the knowledge that it could have been avoided deepened their pain. Yet their advocacy for reform ensured that the tragedy would not be forgotten, leaving a lasting legacy of accountability and safety improvements in aviation. Spanair Flight 5022 remains a sobering reminder of the cost of negligence, but it also serves as a testament to the importance of vigilance in preventing such avoidable disasters. The crash of Spanair Flight 5222 is etched into the annals of aviation history, not just for its tragic loss of life, but also for the profound lessons it taught the world. On August 20, 2008, 154 people lost their lives in an accident that was entirely preventable, a stark reminder of the thin line between routine operations and disaster when safety protocols are compromised. This tragedy highlighted systemic flaws that extended beyond the cockpit and maintenance hangars, reaching into the very structures of the aviation industry. Spanair, like many struggling airlines at the time, faced immense financial pressure. Cost-cutting measures, understaffing, and operational shortcuts created an environment where safety became a secondary concern. The failure to properly address these issues ultimately set the stage for disaster. For the victims' families, the pain of knowing that their loved ones might still be alive, had the proper precautions been taken, added to their grief. Survivors carried not only physical scars, but also the emotional burden of witnessing unimaginable loss. Yet in their advocacy for change, they ensured that the legacy of Flight 5022 would not be forgotten. The official investigation left no doubt about the crash's preventability. It exposed the cascading failures that led to the malfunctioning takeoff configuration warning system, TOWS, the overlooked flap and slat settings, and the broader systemic issues that allowed these errors to persist. The 33 recommendations in the final report became a blueprint for change, pushing airlines and regulators alike to prioritize safety over cost or convenience. Globally, the lessons from Spanair 5022 reverberated throughout the aviation industry. Airlines introduced stricter protocols, ensuring critical systems like the TOWS underwent rigorous testing before each flight. Training programs were revamped to reinforce the importance of redundancy and thorough pre-flight checks. Regulators adopted stronger oversight measures, holding airlines accountable for lapses that endangered lives. However, beyond the technical fixes and policy changes, the tragedy also left a moral imperative: to remember the human cost of neglect. The faces of the 154 who perished and the stories of the 26 survivors stand as a testament to the devastating consequences of complacency. Their lives remind us that safety in aviation, or in any industry, is not a static achievement, but an ongoing responsibility. As we reflect on the crash of Spanair Flight 5022, it's clear that its legacy is twofold. On one hand, it serves as a somber warning of the dangers of cutting corners and ignoring warning signs. On the other, it is a beacon of hope for progress, showing that even the darkest tragedies can lead to meaningful change. Let this story remind us of the stakes involved in every decision made in aviation. Behind every checklist, every alarm, and every procedure are lives entrusted to the system, a system that must never falter again.